Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into some of the absolute darkest chapters of World War II. We're going to be looking at official records and historical accounts to really get a handle on these horrific events. And our goal here isn't just to list off historical facts, but to try and understand them as the profound human tragedies they really were.
So, let's start with this number right here, 33,771. Now, this isn't just some abstract statistic. It represents 33,771 individual lives. We're talking about Jewish men, women, and children, all murdered by Nazi forces and their local collaborators at a ravine just outside of Kyiv, Ukraine, a place called Babi Yar.
And get this, they were all murdered in just 2 days. That's it. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, they were marched to that ravine, forced to strip naked, and then shot, their bodies falling layer by layer into a mass grave. It's one of the largest single massacres of the entire Holocaust, and it really sets a chilling stage for the scale of what we're going to be talking about today.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First up, the atrocities in the Pacific. Then we'll move to the Axis crimes in Europe. After that, we'll get into the Allies' controversial bombings. And finally, we'll look at the search for justice and how we remember these events.
Okay, let's jump into our first section. Atrocities in the Pacific. You know, it's easy to forget that the war in Asia actually started years before Germany invaded Poland. And when it started, it unleashed this incredible wave of brutality, not just against soldiers, but against civilians and prisoners of war too. It completely changed the game.
So this table gives you a quick, grim overview. What's really striking here is how different the atrocities were. On one hand, you have the chaotic, citywide slaughter in places like Nanking and Manila. But then you have this other kind of evil, the cold, calculated cruelty of Unit 731's human experiments, and the systematic torture of prisoners during the Bataan Death March. It's just brutal on every level.
You know, to get people to do something so horrific, you have to dehumanize the victims first. It's essential. At Unit 731, they had a code word for their living human test subjects, Maruda. It means logs. The guards were literally told these people were not human. Think about that. It's a psychological trick to make the unthinkable thinkable, to make it easier to dissect people while they're still alive, or infect them with horrible diseases, or test weapons on them.
And what happened after the war? Well, justice wasn't exactly served. The United States actually granted immunity from prosecution to the commander of Unit 731, a guy named Shiro Ishii, and his top staff. And why? In exchange for all their research data on biological warfare. This whole deal denied justice to thousands of victims, and it set this really troubling precedent for the Cold War, basically saying that strategic advantage could be more important than accountability.
Now, the Bataan Death March. This was a multi-stage nightmare. First, you have the surrender of about 76,000 Filipino and American soldiers. Then came the march itself, 60 miles in the brutal tropical heat, with no food, no water. If you fell behind, you were killed on the spot. But here's the thing, the horror didn't end there. If you somehow survived being beaten and bayoneted and seeing your friends die, you got to Camp O'Donnell. And that was just another form of a death sentence. Overcrowding, disease, starvation. Surviving the march just meant you were going to die a slower death in the camp.
Okay, let's shift gears now and head over to Europe. Here, the atrocities were often, terrifyingly systematic. We're talking about crimes that were meticulously planned out, either to wipe entire populations off the map or to terrorize communities into complete submission. And this wasn't just the Axis powers. The Soviet Union was involved in one of these major crimes as well.
The Katyn massacre is an incredible story, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the massive 50-year cover-up that followed. In 1940, the Soviet secret police executed 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals. When the Nazis found the graves in 1943, they used it for propaganda. But here's the kicker. For the next 50 years, the Soviet Union blamed the Nazis for it, completely suppressing the truth. Families were silenced, history was rewritten, it was a crime buried under another crime of deception, and the truth didn't officially come out until 1990 when Gorbachev finally admitted it.
Now, let's talk about Oradour-sur-Glane. This wasn't a battle. This was a calculated, cold-blooded act of terror. On June 10, 1944, a Nazi SS unit sealed off this small French village. They were angry about French resistance activity and decided to make an example of these people. First, they separated the men, took them to barns, shot them in the legs so they couldn't escape, and then burned the barns down. Then they locked all the women and children in the church and set it on fire. 642 civilians just murdered. Today, the village ruins are still there, exactly as they were left, a permanent silent memorial to what happened. In Eastern Europe, the landscape itself was turned into a weapon. Places like the Babi Yar ravine in Ukraine and the abandoned fuel pits at WWII in Lithuania, they became death factories. Tens, even hundreds of thousands of people, mostly Jews, were shot and buried there. But then, as the Soviet army started pushing back, the Nazis launched this frantic cover-up operation. They forced Jewish prisoners, the so-called burning brigades, to dig up the mass graves and burn all the bodies to destroy the evidence. And once that gruesome job was done, they murdered those prisoners too. It was a horrifying attempt to literally wipe their crimes from the face of the earth.
All right, now we have to turn to one of the most debated parts of the entire war. This is where that line between what's a military necessity and what's a war crime gets really, really blurry. We're talking about the Allied strategy of firebombing German and Japanese cities.
So take a look at these two cities, Dresden and Tokyo. These raids didn't just use regular bombs. They used thousands of tons of incendiaries, specifically to create massive, self-sustaining firestorms. In Dresden, a city packed with refugees in February 45, the heat got so intense, we're talking over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, that it literally suffocated people hiding in their cellars. Then in Tokyo, just a month later, they targeted the city's dense neighborhoods of wooden homes, creating the single deadliest air raid in all of human history. The debate that still rages today is, was this a necessary evil to end the war faster, or was it just a brutal punishment against an enemy that was already on its knees?
And this quote from Major General Curtis LeMay, the guy who commanded the Tokyo firebombing, it says it all. If we had lost the war, we would have been prosecuted as war criminals. That is an absolutely stark admission, isn't it? It just highlights the deep moral ambiguity here. It's a chilling reminder that, sometimes, the definition of a war crime really does depend on who wins the war. History is written by the victors.
So, after going through all of this, what's the takeaway? It's a lot to process, I know. But across all these terrible events, whether they were committed by the Axis or involved controversial tactics by the Allies, you start to see some powerful and pretty disturbing common threads.
First, there's that systematic dehumanization of victims. We saw it everywhere. Then there's the widespread use of terror against civilians. You also see these deliberate attempts to destroy evidence and cover up what happened. And finally, there's this long, often incomplete road to justice. I mean, whether it's calling people logs, justifying the bombing of civilians to break their morale, or marching prisoners until they drop dead, every single one of these things was only possible because the victim's humanity was completely denied. And afterwards, the fight for justice, or even just for an acknowledgement of the truth, has taken generations. And for many, it's still not over.
So why is it so important to confront these histories? Well, remembering this stuff isn't just a passive history lesson, it's an active process. It forces us to ask some really uncomfortable questions. How are nations, how are people capable of doing things like this? It pushes us to recognize the warning signs. And maybe most importantly, it makes us realize just how fragile the rules and laws we've created to prevent these things from ever happening again really are. How do we make sure this future stays different from this past?